It's great to see so many people come along today. I'm going to be facilitating today. I'm Dr. Beth Fulton from the CSIRO. I'm a eco-mathematician is probably the best description for it. Ecologist and mathematician here at the CSIRO. I used to be the CRC in Ecosystem and Environments lead, which led me to see the importance of the work that you're about to see today. But before we get into that, first of all, if Miriam could advance the slide one for me, I'd like to acknowledge the different nations that we're meeting on today and pay my own respect to the elders of those nations, past and present, and in particular on the lands of the Muanina people, to recognise their contributions in the past and acknowledge the ongoing role of the Tasmanian in Aboriginal community today in being custodians of this land. We really appreciate everything that's done and the perspective that they can provide into topics around the blue economy. Miriam, if you can just step one back to the original opening page for me, please. So this is a large body of work that we're going to share today across a whole number of us. We've broken it up to try for each one of us to give you a slightly different perspective on that whole body of work so it knits together. As you can see, it's the actual researchers are drawn from the Griffith University, the University of Tasmania and the CSIRO, but it was a much larger collaboration than that, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But just to give you a little bit of background, so Miriam, if you could jump ahead a couple of slides for me. So the blue economy is what draws us here together today. It's quite an exciting area to be working on. So in its broadest sense, the blue economy involves all marine industries, particularly those that have an eye to being sustainable and equitable and developing our oceans in a way that keeps them healthy, but also allows for a thriving economy. Marine industries already produce about $81 billion within the Australian GDP a year. And just to give you a bit of a sense of the size of that, as that whole, a large part of which does come out of energy. There's 60 billion in agriculture. It's 81 billion all up, sorry. That compares to about 60 billion for agriculture, 70 billion for coal mining, 53 billion for metals, and 69 billion for construction. So it's equally the size of any of those other large industries that we kind of think of as quintessentially Australian in the way that we do things. So it is already a large and chunky part of our economic landscape. Now, parts of that are growing faster than anything else in the economy, both within Australia and internationally. Aquaculture now produces around the world and even in Australia as much as wild capture fisheries do, at least in some parts of it, and also into the energy sector. Renewable energy is growing all the time and is projected to be quite a significant part of any future mix, not just in total, but actually from the ocean contribution. There's been whole webinars that the CRC has held about the size of what that can look like, and with the recent government announcements, that's likely to grow even more. So with that kind of background, there was a sense that we needed to understand the kinds of challenges and opportunities that puts forward. So Miriam, if you could progress the slide for me. So on the right-hand side here, you can see some of the positive sides of having a blue economy, thinking about new ways and new opportunities to do things, whether that's new designs that meet challenges, ways of mimicking nature to allow for a better use of the infrastructure by the natural world. So it's not a sort of an imposition, it's a collaboration almost, to speak with the natural world. What you don't want to do is be the poor person on the left-hand side that has to deal with one of these major disasters, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared for them. So there's a gentleman in my original discipline of fisheries who's quite a large name internationally, Professor John Beddington. He went from fisheries and other things into being a chief scientist for the UK government. And under his leadership, they created a risk registry for all aspects of the UK government, so that if something went wrong, they could immediately, and they had anticipated what it would be, and they could even have things in place to say, look, if we don't have any better information on the day, how can we start to tackle it? It's exactly the kind of preparedness that people have called for around things like the extreme events that we've had over the last few years, the pandemic and other things like that. So with that kind of inspiration, when we started to see what was forming up around the blue economy in Australia and around the activities within the CRC and potential developments into the future, we thought it would be a good idea to understand what that landscape looked like. What were hazards that we would need to consider that everybody thought were important, or there's information that show it's important, versus things that, yeah, they come up, but actually the information is that they're not so critical. And then things that could actually be looked at to opportunities. And so that's what you're going to hear about for the rest of the presentation today. And I will hand over to the other members of the team to carry through to that. But I just first of all like to acknowledge that it was a very large collaboration. It was not every member of the CRC participated, but we did have representatives either as formal project participants or invitees to workshops from pretty much a large proportion of the CRC members, for which we're very grateful. And it meant that we could pull together from lots of different perspectives, both industry as well as academic and research, but also from different disciplines and different backgrounds. And I'm going to hand over to Jess to explain some of the challenges around that and some of the lessons learned. So over to you, Jess.
Thanks very much, Beth, and good afternoon, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us for this seminar. So before Misha, Chris and Miriam talk about the specific methods and results from our project, I'm going to try to just set the scene with respect to the challenges of working with very large multidisciplinary teams, as we did as part of this project. Some of the ways that we addressed those challenges and a few of the things that we learnt along the way. So next slide, please, Miriam. As you heard from Beth, this project aimed to elicit a very broad set of hazards and opportunities, including those related to climate, biosecurity, operations, finance, attitudes and policy, for different aspects of the emerging offshore blue economy, which we referred to as domains, and you can see them there on the left. So the domains that we considered were marine engineering, interactions with the environment, aquaculture production, renewable energy production, economics and society, including policy and the regulatory context, which we grouped as one domain. And so the full project team included experts across all of these domains, with around 50 participants from different sectors and disciplinary backgrounds engaged in the project. Next slide, please, Miriam. So navigating such a broad range of topics and disciplines is challenging enough, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But on top of that, we were doing it during a pandemic. So what was originally planned as in-person workshops to elicit hazards and rankings became fully virtual workshops. And in addition, with such diversity of perspectives and the types of methodologies associated with different disciplines, there weren't any integrated off-the-shelf approaches that we could use. So while this was challenging, it did provide a quite unique opportunity to work together to develop bespoke integrated tools that could be used in a fully virtual environment, which actually resulted in project outputs in the form of interactive web apps that Chris and Misha will talk more about, that have, we think, broader ongoing utility than was originally planned. Thanks, Miriam. Other approaches that we used to try to bring knowledge together via these virtual workshops included co-developing conceptual models, again using online tools, and you'll see some of those models a bit later. And we use those to consider impact pathways, opportunities, and interwove those things with other interactive activities that related to the kinds of concepts and ideas that we were discussing in the workshop. So, for example, a member of the team, Ingrid Van Putten, ran a great interactive activity on risk appetite as part of scene setting for one of our workshops. Next slide, please, Miriam. So over the course of the two main workshops in the project and the intervening period between them, we tried to seek regular feedback from the broader team about what was useful and what we could do more of. And so here on the left, we asked people about the standout aspects of the first workshop, which helped validate that these interactive elements I talked about were successful in terms of bringing together multidisciplinary knowledge. And on the right, we asked people what they'd like to see more of, which had a surprising food focus. We didn't manage any pizza in workshop 2, but we did schedule an end of workshop virtual drink session, as well as a debrief. And we also ran quite a fun brownie in a mug activity in one of the breaks. And sadly, we didn't manage any screen grabs of the finished products, but I can assure you that they were very impressive and absolutely delicious. So next slide, please, Miriam. Another factor that we think helped us navigate the complexities of the project was this onion layers model for the project team, which comprised a smaller core team that organised workshops, developed tools and analysed results. And the core team worked closely with the folks from Ocean Pixel to develop the online registry, which you'll hear about later from Miriam. The next onion layer was a group of methods advisors with particular expertise in approaches for hazard and risk analysis, who helped guide the development of our bespoke methods for hazard elicitation and ranking. And then the outer layer comprised the full set of project participants who engaged in the workshops and the hazard rankings, and who we kept informed via these regular updates and opportunities for feedback. And I've lost my big reveal there, but that's fine because it's great to see his face as part of the onion model. One particular feature of this onion model that also made it really successful was the role that Misha Tershel played as the core of the core. And he did an incredible job of keeping us on track and leading the delivery of outputs. So thank you, Misha. So next slide, please, Miriam. Early on, we recognised that the relatively short duration of the project meant that it wasn't possible to undertake a respectful and meaningful co-designed process with traditional custodians as part of the project. But we also recognise that Indigenous perspectives of risks and opportunities are critically important in the context of the emerging blue economy. So the approach that we used was to undertake a literature review which examined questions of governance and mechanisms for Indigenous participation and inclusion in blue growth. And we used case studies from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And so key findings from the review, which was led by Pethy Lyons, were that a shift in practice of social licence to operate is needed, where consent is granted by Indigenous groups based on their perspective of social licence at all stages of a project life cycle, and whenever new social and cultural risks and opportunities emerge. And we found that this shift in practice across the blue economy would require the consideration of multiple collaborative arrangements and a platform for Indigenous-driven transformation in how Indigenous peoples partner in the sector and in business agreements based on their particular historical, social, cultural and economic contexts and goals. And so the review and its findings are included in the full report from the project if you'd like to read more. And also please feel free to get in touch with me or with Pethy Lyons if you have questions. So next slide, please, Miriam. To finish, I've just included a short summary of our learnings from working across diverse sectoral expertise in the project. And I think as Misha and Chris and Miriam speak, you'll hear these reinforced. Fairly clear that cake was at the top of the list. We did also find that the mixing pot of disciplines led to outcomes that were greater than the sum of their parts, and that there were emergent findings from engaging across diverse sectors. And again, you'll hear more about that a bit later from Misha. Not surprisingly, the multidisciplinary approach was time-consuming, and allowing space to revisit things and bring diverse perspectives together in different ways was really important. And finally, I think it's fair to say that from my perspective, and at least in this project, we found that there are times when disciplinary differences in ontologies and methodologies actually can't be overcome, but they can be accommodated through the kinds of adaptive processes that we tried to develop in this work. So thank you very much, and over to Chris.
And as Chris comes together, thank you, Jess. I'd just like to remind everyone that the Q&A is the best way to drop in questions to Jess or any of us as a part of this. If you have any technical issues, use the chat, but otherwise the Q&A would be great. Thanks, Jess. Okay, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Beth and Jess. I'm Dr. Chris Brown from Griffith University. Next slide, Miriam, please. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about more about the methods that we used. So we had this challenge to bring together experts from all these different disciplines. And part of that challenge is that they all speak different technical languages. So just as an example of that, if you say resilience to an engineer, it means a very different thing than the word resilience to a social scientist. So we're getting these people to work together is one of the challenges that we had to overcome through these workshops. Just next slide. So the way we started to approach that, of course, was just through a literature review, looking at how the different disciplines and domains approach risk analysis. And so as an example of what we found there, for an engineer working in energy infrastructure, they might do a risk analysis in a more typical way, following the ISO risk assessment standards, where they would assess different hazards piece by piece under different criteria. Then they would identify the priorities, and then that would be handed on to the engineers who would run quantitative models and simulations. Whereas in the social science side, they use a process called social impact assessment, where they'd be more focused on engaging both with experts as well as the people impacted by the development, and looking at feedbacks, like two-way feedbacks between society and the proposed development. So some quite big differences there in how they approach risk analysis. So given these differences, next slide, Miriam, thanks. We felt we couldn't have our onion and eat it too. So the only way forward for us really was to work with the experts to co-develop a new method for risk analysis. And that's in fact what we did. Next slide, Miriam. So through this review, we developed our initial approach that drew from themes that cut across all the different disciplines. And our overall aim was to have these experts classify the importance of different hazards against a set of criteria, so we could come up with a ranking. So when, as Beth spoke about earlier on, when governments and industry are looking at what are the top things they need to consider when developing a new wind farm or aquaculture system, they'd have a good list of where to start with that. So when I talk about hazard, I talk about something that has the potential to cause harm, like a storm or escape of fish from aquaculture, or it could be even like geopolitical risks. We're that broad about it. And when we talk about hazards, we ask the experts to think about the hazard as it affects their area of domain. So aquaculture experts were asked to think about hazards as they affect fish farming and the aquaculture industry. So initially we came up with a list of about 100 of these hazards, and then we had to refine those before we did the expert elicitation. So we did that in 4 broad steps. So next slide, Miriam, please. Thanks. So the first was the conceptual modelling. And so the aim of this was to get people together in cross-disciplinary teams and get them to think about the bigger picture of hazards, and maybe broader than they are typically used to in their disciplines. So we split our 50 experts into breakout groups of up to 7 people. And we had one of the core team members moderate each group. And in these groups, we deliberately put them into cross-disciplinary teams to promote that cross-disciplinary thinking. And we use this neat software tool called Mental Modeler, which is a tool for interactively creating network diagrams. So I'll just show you an example of one of those. Miriam, next slide. Thanks. So here's like an abridged version of one. So we asked one of the teams to think about the hazard of biofouling and how that affects the different domains. And it's interesting how multidisciplinary that problem is. So it can affect, the potential for diseases to spread, and that's a biosecurity compliance issue. So it becomes a policy issue. It can create an artificial substrate which might create or hinder tourism opportunities. So there's an effect on the social side. And then it obviously can also affect the efficiency and production from aquaculture facilities. So there's an impact on the aquaculture and economics side. So through building these network diagrams, it helped us think more broadly, but also helped refine our list down to our final list of 56 hazards. And part of the exercise of doing these workshops, we also realized that asking people to assess hazards was a bit too intangible. So we had to define some scenarios. So I'll go to the next slide. Yep. So we gave our experts 2 scenarios. The first was a temperate system where we asked them to think about wind energy co-developed in place with multi-trophic aquaculture. And next slide. Thanks. And the second was a tropical system where we asked them to think about a smaller thermal energy conversion system, also with multi-trophic aquaculture. So once we had this, we then went to the elicitation process. The next slide. Yep. So for that, we asked experts to rank hazards in their domain. And we wanted to give them different criteria to rank against. So there's obviously different aspects of risk. So next slide. So we picked these 4 criteria, which is a bit more than a typical risk assessment, because we wanted to span a broad span of criteria of relevance to different domains. So we asked them to rank hazards on likelihood. The hazard is hazard impact. So for instance, you may say that storms are more frequent than biosecurity breaches. Then the consequence, so that's the degree of the impact if it happens. So biosecurity might have bigger consequences for aquaculture industries than storms do. Then the difficulty of detecting. So biosecurity breaches might be much harder to detect than a storm is to detect. And then the difficulty in responding to the impacts of that hazard if it was to happen. So a classic one there is climate change. It's very hard to respond to at the farm scale, because obviously climate change requires a globally coordinated response. And then finally, Michelle will also present results on these criteria as well as a multi-criteria score. So if we go to the next slide. So once we had our criteria and the hazards set up, then we just had to ask the experts to rank all the hazards. So this is where we developed the web application to help facilitate this in the online context. So if you go to the next slide, just have an example of that. So on the left-hand side, experts would log in and they'd select their domain of expertise and the particular scenario they wanted to have. And then they'd be presented with a list of hazards. And they just had to drag and drop them into these 4 boxes of low, moderate, higher, extreme. And so through that, we can get an idea of the relative importance of those different hazards. And then they repeated that process for each of the criteria. So, they might put some on low under likelihood, but those hazards might be higher in consequence. And then the coloured bars at the top there, that just let experts adjust their expectations about how extreme would be. So once we did that, and we ran the workshop multiple times to make sure we got multiple experts, and we let experts go back and revise their hazards after discussing them, so we could standardize somewhat across different people. We ended up with 46 experts ranking up to 56 hazards across 4 criteria. So we had over 6,000 individual responses. So I'll hand over to Misha now, and he'll talk about how we analysed that and the summary results of that. Thanks for listening.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Chris. So here's finally the big reveal. So what did we find? Miriam, next slide, thank you. So as Chris mentioned, we had 52 sets of hazard rankings, and this is just a slight breakdown of the expertise within that. So obviously it was very hard to achieve equal representation across such a diverse disciplinary team, but we did pretty well, I think, given the circumstances. And in terms of our ranking, so we ranked these hazards overall by combining the scores across domains where we needed to, and as well within domain. So aquaculture had their own list of rankings versus renewable energy production or society or environment. And that's the rankings I'll be presenting and talking through today. But we're not here to see blank lists, so let's get on to the big reveal. Miriam, thank you. So this is essentially a focus on the domain-specific rankings to give you a bit more of a deep dive into some of these differences. This table here is showing you the top hazards that were included in the top 10 for at least 3 of the 6 domains. And the darker colors are indicating that that particular hazard was ranked right up the top, so like first or second, whereas those lighter blues mean it was sort of ranked maybe in the lower end of that top 10. And across those hazards, you can see things like climate change, specifically changes in oceanographic properties, and the impacts of marine heat waves was pretty considerably as a top hazard across the board. Just to note, we did have domain-specific hazard lists. So if there's a box as a grade out there, it means that domain didn't actually undertake that ranking, if you're wondering why. We also had things like cumulative effects of multiple different activities affecting the ecosystems, obviously things like rough weather in moving into offshore or high energy environments, as well as things like social license, the potential for structural failure of the actual infrastructure, and then things like biosecurity, and then a couple of more economic focused risks around market access and development costs. Next slide, thank you. So I'm going to go even deeper and sticking to this onion theme with our lovely plots. One of the most interesting findings was that the perceptions of risks seem to differ between domains. So even though multiple domains ranked climate change as a really important hazard, there were really interesting differences, especially when we start to look at the specific criteria. So going around clockwise from the top right-hand side there, we have our criteria of how hard it is to respond to the impact of that hazard, and then consequence, how hard it is to detect it, the likelihood of it, and then that MCA is the overall averaged multi-criteria score. And each of the different colors along there are representing a different box of those particular domains that undertook the ranking for that hazard. So just on climate change, as you can see that we had quite a breadth of actual perception of how likely it would be to impact the scenario that we provided experts in that 10-year time frame. So for example, in the purple box on likelihood, that's basically anyone from environment ranked it as very likely to have impacts. Whereas from the renewable energy side of things and marine engineering, the perceived likelihood was to be much lower. Although, as Chris mentioned, everyone sort of was very extreme to respond to, highlighting some consistency across there. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another interesting one, I'll show you a few of these. This was looking at criminal activity that disrupting operations, and that included cybersecurity. So really interestingly, all domains agreed that this was a pretty low likelihood, but again, there were some real differences in perception of how hard that would be to respond to impacts of cybersecurity or crime, as well as how hard it would be to detect. You can see there's some real differences here that potentially open the door for cross-domain collaboration and learning where there might be some information that one domain knows that is sort of more privy compared to another. So real opportunities for knowledge sharing here. Next slide, thank you. For an example of an ecosystem and more of a social hazards, we looked at how we ranked how likely interactions with large pelagic species such as whales or seals and seabirds might be. Again, the likelihood varied across those different domains there. But an important one was, I guess, that highlights the beauty of capturing these more fine scale patterns is that you can see on the consequence, and that second one across from the right, you can see that any interactions with large pelagics and seabirds are perceived as quite high consequence for society. So that leads to implications in terms of social license. So we had a nice little breakdown here. Next slide, thanks, Miriam. And another benefit, though, of being able to view our hazard rankings like this is we could actually identify lowly ranked hazards that potentially could be retired and not needing to be progressed to more formalized risk assessments. So the whole purpose of this registry, I guess, and this exercise was to really identify and do a bit of a triaging process of hazards. And if there were hazards that are ranked highly, they may need to be considered and progressed to more quantitative risk assessments, or we may be able to retire and say these hazards aren't going to be of concern. No need to waste or conserve resources for that particular hazard. So for example, hazards associated with maritime transport were pretty much consistently perceived as being only low risk across all the different domains that ranked that. Next slide, thank you. So we've talked a lot about the hazards and more about the impacts, but Chris mentioned we've been talking about opportunities as well. And this is the actual complete version of one of the conceptual models that Chris showed the simplified version of before, focusing on biofouling and the different impact pathways. And this is essentially highlighting in yellow there the different types of opportunities that, that popped up through these interactive discussions with diverse disciplinary experts. So we identified potential opportunities that were associated with this biofouling hazard, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But things like different new build technology to shape the fouling and materials technology that might be more fouling resistant. So all in all, we had 22 of these quite large and different complexity conceptual models that we analysed. And then we identified all the opportunities that down there and essentially grouped them into 4 primary themes, which I'll walk through in a moment. Next slide, thank you. So these 4 main themes, the first 2 were around technology in that policy and regulatory context. So for technology, it was pretty much consistently identified that things like sensor development for monitoring was a real opportunity that we could see from we identified from these conceptual models. So things like drones or more remote monitoring data to collect information of the environment and monitor environmental conditions, as well as things like artificial intelligence to monitor the aquaculture and the fish species, as well as things like new material and engineering innovations as well to deal with these high energy and offshore environments. From a policy and regulatory context, the cumulative effects was considered a pretty high ranking hazard across all the domains that ranked it. So there's opportunities to develop frameworks for regulating these cumulative effects more and assessing them more robustly. So we have in the report, there's a much more broadened list of these in specific opportunities. Next slide. The other 2 themes were around business development and actually environmental opportunities. So from the business development side of things, we saw things like an example might be tourism, where there's potential, if we're talking about having integrated platforms with the co-location of potential different activities, there might be tourism opportunities associated with dining or tours or diving, recreational fishing out on these potential platforms. As well as from an environmental perspective, there's drawing from a large body of literature around oil and gas and decommissioning. There's potential for that infrastructure to act as an artificial reef, actually benefiting biodiversity. Well, we might not have a bridge. That was the only icon I could find that was similar. Next slide, thank you. So I guess something that we focused on these top hazards and opportunities, but one other real benefit I think that came out of this research was the potential for increased knowledge sharing. So here, this table is actually showing where there were real polar opposites in how different domains perceive that particular hazard. So where there were, I guess, big gaps where there's potential for better collaboration and opportunity. So if the hazard was, the box is blue, it means the hazard was considered in the top 10 for that particular domain. But if the hazard is in that red or orange category, that means it was actually listed in the bottom for that particular domain. And this helped us really identify where there might be gaps in knowledge, where domain sharing of different expertise and knowledge could potentially benefit and alleviate some of these hazards. So if you just click Miriam, please. So if one example in particular was this criminal activity and cybersecurity. So while aquaculture, production and marine engineering found it to be quite high, considered it as a high risk, economics and society consider it much lower on the spectrum. So again, there might be potential for increased knowledge sharing there by looking at these different mismatches in hazards. Again, this occurred for quite a diverse range of hazards. So again, plenty of opportunities here for increased knowledge sharing. Next slide, thank you. So again, I guess the takeaways and wrap of this whip around of some of the high level results. Sticking again to the food theme, we think that there's maybe cake is the way to promote this increased knowledge sharing and sharing of ideas and knowledge across domains of expertise. But really the crux takeaway is that our results contribute to identifying hazards that either could be safely retired if there's consensus across all domains that it doesn't really need to be progressed past this stage, or where there's a little bit more uncertainty that you might need to collect more information about that hazard. Finally, for those top hazards where there's consensus from everyone, that's where we think that might be progressed to more quantitative risk assessment. So these results provide a real sounding board and triage tool to identify and progress to the next steps of what we need to do for these hazards in terms of actually moving into these offshore high energy waters. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand over to Miriam, who's going to talk about the risk registry.
And don't forget, after Miriam, there's going to be a Q&A session. So please pop any questions you've got for everybody into the Q&A in preparation. Over to you, Miriam.
Great, thank you, Beth and Misha. So for the last portion of this webinar, we're going to dig a bit deeper into the results that we had. And the reason behind it is that we will have a report. There's a report that you can read and you can have access to this synthesized information. But we also wanted to provide a platform or a way for people to interact a bit more intimately with the data. So, and what was important to them and what they could be dig a little deeper into certain aspects of the project. So the registry that will be online is meant to share information that was collected during the ranking exercise for this project and the different hazards that we explored. It's also meant for people in general to explore the hazards across these different domains and how they're linked to each other. And in general, as an initial screening tool for potential developments or other uses. So going back to this onion layer model that we have for the project, so web development was done externally as a project partner. So Ocean Pixel is a participant in the Blue Economy and worked closely with the core team to develop this potential platform. And today we're just going to go briefly through the different basic functionalities of the platform, just so people have a better idea of what could be potentially feasible to do with it. So the platform is a website essentially consisting of two broad things that will be available to people. So visualization, this is a way to see the data and see the information that we collected in slightly different ways, for example, than what Misha just showed. But we also give the opportunity for people to essentially access the raw data. So all of these rankings of the different hazards across the domains for people to do their own analysis or whatever they deem fit for their application. All of this, again, was generated through Ocean Pixel. So some of the visualization, we struggled a bit in the beginning as to how we could best visualize the information. So this is a network graph, essentially, just showing the connectivity of these different hazards in different domains. So you can go around interactively and see for each domain how many total hazards were identified in these domains, how many were identified as low risk overall through this multi-criteria analysis, and how many of these hazards were identified as high risk. You can zoom in and essentially see some hazards crossing all of these domains. Some hazards only affected one particular or two domains, but some of them were very central to the understanding across all of these domains. This is a way for people to explore essentially the different hazards that we had. You can go a little deeper too and try to understand for certain ranking criteria. So for example, here it's consequence, the distribution of hazards. So this is just a simple bar plot essentially showing for extreme hazards, which in the case was 4, how they're partitioned against the different domains. So society, marine engineering, and agriculture production. So the first takeaway from these figures that most of these hazards in general rank between moderate and high, and that, for example, marine engineering had more moderate hazards overall per domain than they were high. So you can play a bit interactively with these, change the ranking criterion essentially that you would be interested in and see for each what information you're interested in. So marine engineering, for example, ranking only a few hazards as low and extreme, but most of them in the low. You can also see, well, what are these hazards that are extreme risks? So for example, in this case, extreme risk for aquaculture production would be biosecurity or concerns around biosecurity. And then you can explore essentially each hazard individually. So marine engineering for high risk structural failure or manufacturing defects or inadequate assessment of cumulative effects. So it gives you an idea for each ranking criterion where they sit at this point with the information that we collected, and give you a broad overview of how to go about understanding the information. You can also explore by hazard. So far we've really explored overall what was available. We've also explored the different domains and how each domain had a pool of hazards essentially associated with them. But we can also dig into particular hazards and see how it translates across domain, if that is something of interest to the user. So for example, in that sense, this is the uncertainty over applicable risk standards for deployed infrastructure and operations offshore. And you can see that, for example, the response criteria differs quite significantly between society and marine engineering. In the same way, marine engineering seems to rank consequence for that hazard as much higher in general than economics or agriculture production. So you can see for a particular hazard how it translates across these different domains, and have the visualizations available to you to see that. But we can also dig into the raw data. So essentially, this is just showing all of the raw information, much less as a visualization, but in a table format in case people are interested in that. So this is, if you click on likelihood, all the highly ranked hazard will come up first across all domains. You can also select a particular domain that you're interested in, and the multi-criteria analysis will then rank which one came up first and second and so on, according to different criteria or overall with the multi-criteria analysis. So this is a possibility to essentially play with that table and potentially get an initial understanding about these different domains. Importantly, as you will be able to access and obtain this information via, for example, an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF, so that you can download it yourself and use it in other software. So this is an interactive online registry, but it's also meant to be evolving. And that's a key takeaway, I think, to finish this discussion, is that we have done quite a bit of work into collecting these sets of rankings with these experts, but this is meant to be updated essentially within the CRC with project participants as we learn more about existing hazards, and we can then better understand where they would sit in that ranking. As new expert perspectives are provided, potentially going through a similar exercise, but with additional experts over time, but also as new hazards are uncovered, or some of them might be retired eventually. So this is meant to be evolving as with the lifetime of the CRC to get a better understanding of the risks and opportunity that we can have for these industries. So that is all I had. I will pass it over back to Beth for the final words.
Thank you, Miriam. So as Miriam just reflected, the registry exists. I had a conversation this morning with the CRC about how to make that public. So within the next 2 weeks, it will be a public link on the CRC webpage with a user guide and tool tips and the capacity for anybody to be able to look at it. In the short term, it will remain that static snapshot of the information we collected. But as Ocean Pixel has allowed it to be an updatable database and has shown us how to do that, we're just figuring out the last little details of how to make some of that public facing as well, so people can add their own information going forward, or download it and use it in things like environmental impact assessments for the cumulative effects assessments and things like that. So we hope that you're as enthused by all this as we are, and the useful information that's come together. There's a few questions there that I'm going to start throwing at the panelists, but if you have any more, please keep them coming in. So I'm going to throw this one at Misha first, because he and Miriam helped pull together quite a long list of hazards in the first place. But Misha, was the jurisdictional policy failure considered, such as stocking rates in excess of actual assimilative capacity?
In short, no, because we didn't look at that level of detail, say around that stocking rates per se. We did look at some of the more broad issues around sort of lack of environmental monitoring frameworks or some of that regulatory context, I guess, in establishing industries, but not so specific for a particular industry like that. And feel free to chip in, anyone else, if I've missed something there as well.
It's probably worth reflecting to the audience that it was quite a long list of over 100 or getting close to a couple of hundred hazards that were broken down to the 56 that we ranked by grouping them up. So they were high level. It hasn't gone to a quantitative step as yet. Did anyone else want to follow up on that? No, okay. So we'll go to the next question. Do you think that agreement or similarities in responses on risk from different sectors speaks to the likelihood of finding some consensus on solutions? And any thoughts on whether such agreement in responses might serve as a proxy for social license? So there would be fewer barriers to implementing any solutions, potentially painful solutions. Thank you, Damien. I'm going to throw to Jess first for this so that she can have a go.
I just think it's an excellent question that is also a great observation. And I mean, I would say I would hope so. And I think that some of the discussions that we had in the workshops around that would hit at least the first part. The dog's contributing to, obviously, to my answer. But it would be good to hear from the other panelists as well, because I think that's a really important question.
Thanks, Jess. Chris, would you like to chip in?
Well, just Alice Jones's question too about what were consistently higher ranking risks that, you know, climate change comes up. So I think there's consensus there across, you know, industries and environmental experts that we need to do things to address climate change at that, like, you know, development scale. So that could be monitoring to inform proactive actions to avoid storms or, you know, and damage to infrastructure. And obviously, you know, action on greenhouse gas emissions is critical, but there's lots that can be done at the farm scale, I think, through monitoring and being able to respond. And that's beneficial across multiple different domains.
Thanks, Chris. Miriam, did you want to chip in at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a great question. And I think that while it might prohibit some consensus, it's actually an opportunity as well to see different perspectives and how some people might not necessarily see something as being high risk and others would, and vice versa, can create more creative, potentially, solutions to these issues. So it's I don't think it's an impediment necessarily. I think it's good to make these integrated assessments so that people can see different perspectives and then work towards essentially working together to find what is a highly ranked among different sectors and what differs essentially.
And Misha?
Not much more to add, but I guess the one caveat would be that, I mean, we didn't specifically consider the community perspectives. This is a real focus on industry and academics, obviously with diverse expertise, but there's maybe consensus among us, but then if you go and take that to the community, that obviously needs to be a real consideration. So.
Yeah, so I'm about to spring something on Jess that she doesn't know about, but there will be a follow-up webinar in maybe a month's time or a few months' time around particularly the Indigenous paper and literature review and the perspective that comes from that. So hopefully that will also help broaden people's perspective on how this might be approached. Okay, so thank you, Damien. Nick Rains has put in a question asking, are you intending to align your hazard analysis and risk ratings with risk tolerance and acceptable levels of risk by government, business and or society? So different people have different perspectives. Doing so may have implications for what risks need to be managed and which can be remain as they are. So, Chris, this might be a chance to discuss how we allowed people to reflect their perceptions of what were risks already.
Good, yeah, thanks for the pointer. Yeah, so part of the process was for a subset of experts that were able to participate in two workshops. We had that rank it individually, and then we followed up with discussions where they could compare their rankings and discuss why they rank things differently or similarly. And so that allowed for some standardization across different people and thinking about risk tolerance. And then we also had the slider bars to kind of try and represent in a qualitative way if someone thought the extreme category should be particularly extreme. But we tend to find most people didn't use those slider bars actually. So the discussion was the most informative part of it. Yeah. And some of that information is less quantitative, it's more qualitative and captured in the report through the notes.
Misha, do you think in the registry itself that the capacity to drill down into the information would allow people with different risk tolerance to say, actually, that's rated low, but for my perception, I would make it moderate. So when they download the information, they can adjust it themselves to the different needs?
Yeah, definitely. But I also think it's probably, we need to be clear that this was a hazard analysis as opposed to risk assessment more broadly, which is a much larger encompassing process. And I guess if we were to actually translate any of these findings to the government, business or society, it would actually have to go through a more formalized risk assessment process for some of these hazards. But again, this is more that first initial stepping stone and point of contact. So these aren't sort of the quantitative assessments per se that could be used for those standards. I wouldn't imagine so. That's just into the technical, I guess, more literature that we learned throughout this project.
Thanks, Misha. So someone who's an anonymous attendee has asked, are these assessment criteria part of defining how the ocean can be used to benefit all parts of society, so economy and infrastructure? Miriam, maybe that's a question for you to start off with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I would answer it quite well. I think that as we digged into that list of hazards, and personally, and working closely with Misha and others on this, I became quite pessimistic about things and really focusing on what could go wrong. So it was a very difficult process in order to see, well, what are all the things that could go wrong, however unlikely this could happen, and then throw that to experts. In that sense, we really only focused on where opportunities could lie for mitigation of these hazards. And this project was never really designed to see how benefits essentially could be extracted from that. But this is a question that could be answered based on the work that we did into phrasing the research questions a bit differently and see how opportunities could arise in these different ways, but not necessarily focusing on mitigating what could go wrong. So I hope it answered some of that question. Others are welcome to pitch in as well.
Thanks. Jess, did you have anything you wanted to contribute on that one?
No, and I've actually needed to leave 5 minutes ago, but I've been hanging on to try to remain part of what's a great discussion and some really great questions trickling in. And I hope that particularly these questions that are still coming in around the community and Indigenous perspectives, it would be good to have further discussion around that. Yeah, but perhaps as part of another seminar. So thank you again, and apologies, I have to leave. I've got another seminar to present, but thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jess. Chris or Misha, did you want to comment as yet?
Yeah, I guess I agree with Miriam that it was kind of focused on the hazards and the opportunities through mitigation, and also the opportunities that emerged through that network modeling thing. So that's where we, I guess, identified benefits of relevance to the CRC through development of new technologies that might benefit multiple, both through hazard mitigation, but also benefits the society or the environment or production.
Yeah,
so I don't have much to add.
It's probably also worth pointing out to everybody that the assessment criteria, because there was no existing method that is widely used around the world, and that it was a hazard analysis rather than a risk assessment, that the group as a whole, the 50 experts involved, helped select what those criteria were in assessing a hazard. So what they felt comfortable commenting on, where they had knowledge. And so that's why it looks at not just likelihood and consequence, but the capacity to detect and respond. So it could be that in some parts, the topic area is just so new, particularly within Australia, that there's not a lot of confidence in commenting yet where some of those benefits are. I think that will grow through time, and that might be a place where the living nature of this registry can allow for that to be reflected more fully into the future. So we hope that answers that person's question. Okay, so now Rob Lewis has pointed out that he's associated with interests addressing offshore wind farms and was wondering if non-CRC partners can access the platform for use in their own operations, and if so, what are the basic terms? So as I sort of reflected on the end of Miriam's part of the talk, within the next couple of weeks, yes, it will be public facing. Apart from acknowledging that the information comes from the CRC in paperwork, any other terms would likely be listed on the registry at that time, but so far I don't think there's anything there. I don't believe that anybody else has had any more up-to-date conversations than me apart from that, so that might be the best answer for that one. But yes, it is going to be out there to help everybody to understand what this information is. Okay, so we have another question from Alice Jones. So following up on the community and traditional owner perspective points from Misha and Beth, you mentioned that the tool is designed to be updated. Is there an opportunity to go through the same or similar process with traditional owners and local communities to get a more diverse perspective? That's a great question. It's pity Jess has stepped away, so I'll take first go and then we can spread it back out to everybody else. If we can write an EOI that's good enough for the CRC to fund it, then definitely from within the CRC. But I would also say that more broadly, the interest in Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous-led science and having what's called a culturally centred social licence to operate would see that this would be a really important step going forward, even from outside the CRC, I think. So I think there's plenty of scope. Did anyone else on the panel want to comment on Alice's comment as well? No.
I'd just say that, yeah, the tool that Chris developed to undertake this whole elicitation was so much more interactive than just sitting there and filling out an online Google form or something. So it was actually a really engaging kind of tool that I think a lot of participants reflected on and said how useful it was to undertake something that was actually quite a large elicitation load from a mental perspective. So I think there's definitely benefit and potential to take it out to community if there is funding for that.
Thanks, Misha. So I think we must have astounded everybody because their questions are over. So unless there's any last bit of questions that pop up, I think that might be it for today. We hope you really enjoyed everything. I'd like to thank all of the panel members for coming and presenting today, for everyone who's come to listen. And I'd just like to remind people that the CRC will be holding another webinar on the 1st of September at 4 p.m. on the trends, challenges and future perspectives for floating offshore wind turbine development. And if you can register for that on the Blue Economy website. And if you have any follow-up questions that you didn't want to ask here, feel free to email us. And if you can't find us easily online, there is a project webpage that you can go to. If you can't find that, you can pretty much Google any of us and you'll find us pretty easily. But we're happy to take further questions and any follow-up from anyone who's interested in hearing more. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.